Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features, or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Hey, compañeros, this is Carlos, and welcome to episode 84. I am joined, as always, by Steve Stedman. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Carlos.
As always, by Steve Stedman. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Carlos. This week's guest is Kathi Kellenberger.
Yeah, so Kathi is an author and trainer with several Pluralsight courses. She's published several books, speaks regularly at past events.
She also does T-SQL development and query tuning and business intelligence development. And you might know her as Aunt Kathi on Twitter. And our topic for this podcast is the Microsoft MVP program. And with Kathi being a MVP, she has brought us a little bit of insight to how that program works, what it is, and some of the benefits of it.
Yeah, that's right. I think there is a lot of interest in this program, particularly for those of us who are in the PaaS community. We hear speakers talk all the time about being a Microsoft MVP. So we thought we'd talk a little bit about what the program is, how you become a part of it, and then her experiences with the program.
Yep. And I know we've had several MVPs. He's a recent MVP, and we just thought it'd be good to sort of go through and make sure everyone knows what that means and what it is.
That's right. And I guess we'll talk about it after the conversation with Kathi, I think. But, a little bittersweet conversation in that. And so full disclosure, and I hope you're okay with me sharing this, Steve. But so both Steve and I have been through the application process through the MVP program, but and haven't been able to make it over that threshold. And, and so I think this is something a lot of people think about. And again, so I think her insights will be helpful about the program.
Maybe one day, but we're not worthy yet.
Yeah, not yet. We're not worthy.
Yeah.
We do, however, have a couple of compañero shout-outs. We want to talk to Dakpak Zach. He mentions our episode that you talked about with Randolph on the indexes. So combining some new knowledge and some reinforcement of some old stuff. So thanks for putting that out. We're glad that you enjoyed that. One of the things that was interesting, there was actually a Twitter feed or discussion about this later, and that was on those maintenance plans. And it had never dawned on me that the way that they are in the GUI is going to, updating those stats, like the rebuilding the indexes and the updating of the stats, the way they kind of get processed in some of those maintenance plans is because that's the way they are, click, click, click in the GUI. And funny enough, after that episode, that came up and somebody had reached out to Randolph to ask him about that. And he referenced our podcast that we had mentioned.
Yep,
that.
And that was sort of referring to the process of getting a reorganize of your indexes, a rebuild of your indexes, and an update of your statistics one after another. And somebody is referring to that as good maintenance plans. And the question came up of, is that really good? And the answer is, oh no, it is not.
Of course, we're going to be linking to some of the things that Kathi talks with us about. That will be available at SQLDataPartners.com/Kathi. And Kathi spells her name with an I. And now it's time for a little SQL Server in the news.
Yes. All right. So one of the big announcements this week is the Microsoft SQL Server vNext release of CTP 1.3. And that's the latest preview of the next version of SQL Server, both on Linux and on Windows. And one of the big announcements this week in that is that the Linux version now includes SQL Server availability groups.
Make a lot of Linux folks very, very happy.
Yep. And it looks like on this, whenever the next release comes out, there's a lot of focus on sort of that engine and getting it to run on the Linux side, and that there won't be as many new features probably as we've seen in the previous couple of releases of SQL Server, but the focus is getting it to run on Linux, and that's a pretty big endeavor that they're taking on there.
No, exactly. It's funny. I'm actually going to be on Ruby Rogues in the podcast here in a couple of weeks. And that's one of the things that their big complaints have been is just trying to connect to SQL Server in the past. Now that they have a Linux version, a lot of those type of languages are going to be looking at SQL Server a little bit more thoroughly because it's kind of in their realm in an operating system that they speak a little bit better.
Yep. And if you want to find out more about SQL Server on Linux, you can always go back to our interview with Travis Wright. I think it was in November when
That's
SQL
right.
Server for Linux was first announced or first released.
Yeah, episode 70.
Yep.
So another piece of news I wanted to talk a little bit about. Last week, Google announced the release of a globally distributed database called Spanner. So Spanner has been running the AdWords Google for some time. And there are actually a couple of other organizations that are starting to use this. And it's in a new category of SQL. So you've probably heard mention of NoSQL creeping in, right? So kind of a document-based approach to databases. And so you have relational and NoSQL. Well, now there's kind of this new word that was coined in 2011 by the guys at the 451 group called NewSQL. And so NewSQL is kind of this idea of making a globally distributed database ACID compliant that supports SQL, the SQL language. And so Google has introduced this, and there's actually an image, which we'll put again on the show notes, that has all kinds of different classifications of databases. And I have to admit, I thought I was doing pretty good knowing some of these NoSQL databases, but there's probably, 30 databases on there? And some of them I'd never even heard of.
Yep. Oh, yeah. There's a lot of different varieties of databases out there these days. And I think that a lot of the big players are coming along and adding theirs, like Microsoft with the different Azure type databases and Google, and as well as Amazon. But there's also a lot of little players out there that are trying to get started and build that new type of database that is different than what we've seen before. I think just like the Linux community can now consider SQL Server as an option for storing their data, the SQL Server community can also consider some of these other solutions when it's the right tool for the job. And I think that SQL Server is a really amazing product, but it's not the right tool for every single job out there. And I think that some of these other databases are interesting options to take a look at.
Right. And I think with the adoption of Microsoft of that hybrid approach to the cloud, I think we're going to start seeing, we as database professionals are going to start seeing into support additional varieties of databases, right? Like you're starting to see a lot more Mongo DB sessions at Past Summit. And then of course there's Document DB, which is the Microsoft flavor, of that. But I think even some of these other, Cassandra and, are going to make their way into the vernacular a bit more. And even just from the ability to go and do something else, if that's what we wanted, having a database that is SQL, I think they're saying SQL compliant, but that has ACID properties to it, globally distributed, again, just kind of changes and makes things easier for businesses and then, of course, for administrators to keep a handle on things. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues to play out.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, how Microsoft responds to it. So,
well, should we jump into the episode?
Let's do it. So, Kathi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited about it.
Yes, I'm glad that we were finally able to put this together. And of course, the rest, as they say, is history. But this is something that we've been trying to get together since October of 2015. So it's a long time coming, and we're glad to finally have you on the show.
Yeah.
And as your Twitter handle suggests, Aunt Kathi, right?
Yes.
You're a family member to all and a great member of our community. And so we're excited to chat with you.
Thank you.
And we have an interesting topic to cover today. And that topic is?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the MVP, Microsoft MVP, what it means to be an MVP and what it's meant to you. And so I guess let's go ahead and jump into that and give us a little bit of your story there. How long have you been an MVP first, I guess?
Okay. I was first awarded the MVP in 2008. And then in 2010, I took a detour in my career and ended up at Microsoft for about a year and a half. So So I lost it during that time. And so then I got it back again in 2013 and have had it every year since then. So kind of a weird back and forth, but once I was eligible again, I got it again. So that's how
Right.
long.
So now, ultimately, looking at the MVP website, right? Microsoft is looking to professionals to provide support and guidance, if you will, to the community, kind of taking their time to help others along their way, particularly, with the Microsoft technology stack. I guess, what do you see are kind of the qualities of being an MVP?
Yeah, we probably should clarify that it's not a job, nothing paid. It's an award that Microsoft gives. So I feel like in some ways we're an extension of Microsoft sales because the things that we do, I'm sure, help companies use SQL Server more effectively, are free support for people in a way. Think about it is that I can share my enthusiasm about SQL Server. I have this problem where when I learn something, the first thing I want to do is go tell somebody else about it. And this is a great way to be recognized for that because it's like a 20-hour per week unpaid job in some respects, because I feel like that's about how much time I spend a week on MVP type activities. And, some of it you get paid because if you write a book, you get paid a little bit. But for the most part, it's like a part-time unpaid job. But
Interesting.
yeah.
I had never heard that number before. 20 hours a week. That's quite a bit.
Yeah.
But when you think about some of those other things, I mean, you mentioned writing a book, blog posts, speaking in front of people, preparing a presentation.
Right. Yeah. Pluralsight courses. I volunteer at a nonprofit to teach people about SQL Server, a user group. Being an independent consultant right now, if I only am billing 15 or 20 hours that week, I'm going to fill in the rest of the week with the MVP type stuff.
So then when you're doing that and you're doing your 15 or 20 hours that's focused on that, are you keeping track of that and somehow having to report that to Microsoft? Or is that just what you do to be out there and be recognized as an MVP?
You don't have to keep track of it on an hourly type basis. I did keep track of it for about 2 months, just because I was interested in how much I was staying. But then that timekeeping, that gets to be a job in itself. Sure. So I just wanted an idea, so I kept track. What you have to do as a current Microsoft MVP, there's a website where you have to upload your activities. So if I speak at a SQL Saturday, I have to fill out a form and said I spoke at the SQL Saturday. There were 30 people in the room and said I spoke at the SQL Saturday. There were 30 people in the room, linked to it. So you have to record your activities, and that's for renewal. So let's say you're awarded the MVP. You don't have to do anything for the next year. You're an MVP. You could drop off the face of the earth as far as community stuff is concerned. There's no requirements. But to get renewed, you have to do things. So you do report, but it's not an hourly type thing.
Okay, so then the title MVP stands for Microsoft's Most Valuable Professional. Is that
something like that? Yeah, most valued professional, I think.
So you've done all this work, and you need to keep doing that work in order to keep getting it year after year.
Yes.
I mean, that's a lot of things you need to do there. And what are the benefits that you gain for doing that?
My favorite is a free MSDN subscription, which includes Azure credits. So that's probably I can really use and have available to me very easily any of the developer tools, SQL, Windows operating systems, things like that for training or experimenting, that type of thing. So that's really my favorite. The other, probably my second favorite, which I don't always take advantage of, is the MVP Summit up in Redmond. That's the last couple of years. It's been like either overlapping. One year it was overlapping the past summit, and the last couple of years it's been the week after or a couple weeks after. That's just really awesome because you are on the Microsoft campus. You're surrounded by, in my case, lots of my friends are MVPs. I'm pretty lucky. Get to hang out with friends a lot more and learn about the new things that are coming up. That's probably the third thing that's a really great benefit is you get a lot of insider information about what's coming up next or all of the things that are not public knowledge at this point. Obviously, you got to keep those things to yourself, but that's
Sure.
pretty cool. And they also have webinars from time to time about things that are coming up. And in fact, the last year or so, they've really increased the frequency of those webinars. So if there's a topic you're interested in, just watch, and chances are there'll be information about what's coming up, or maybe what's in the next service pack, or what's the new features in the next version of SQL. So there's really a lot of
Now,
benefits that way.
okay. Now I've seen that there's like different categories of MVPs in each country. Like you might have a data platform MVP or an Azure MVP. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. And in fact, last year they revamped all their categories. We were SQL Server MVPs, and now we're data platform MVPs. And another really interesting thing, SQL Server MVPs, and now we're data platform MVPs. And another really interesting thing is that you can now be awarded MVP in multiple areas. So, for example, somebody is really focused on SQL Server, but they're also really focused on Windows Server, they might get an award in that area. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, PowerShell is probably another category that overlaps quite a bit as well.
Yeah. And I don't know all the categories. I just look for what I do. So at this point, everything's been SQL Server. However, I've overlapped a tiny bit into the security area because I did a course for Pluralsight, and I've spoken on it at a few places on Kerberos. So I just went ahead and put those in security. When you add your activities, you have to kind of put them in a category. So for people that have some, different areas. I talked about the task necessarily that great. If you are like a database administrator at one company, I was when I became an MVP originally, and my company did not care. They really could care less.
Right.
But as a consultant or somebody with your own company, it's gold. It's going to get you noticed and really be beneficial.
One of the things, that criteria that they talk about grading on as well, or it's included, if you will, of contributions, and that is form replies and answers.
Yeah.
And even just somebody who's searched forms and whatnot, or put questions out on forms, I am always amazed at the people who can respond. The hashtag SQL help is probably another good example, right? They're just like, they're waiting, right? And they just almost, it seems like, and what's also interesting is that they have really good answers. So a couple of people that kind of jump to mind. So Aaron Bertrand on Stack Overflow, I don't know how many points he's got. Robert Davis. Robert Davis is another one, probably on the SQL help. Seems like he's always chiming in, every so often. I have never been able to get into that because I guess maybe I'm, as a knuckle dragger, I guess I don't know all that much.
Nah, I'm sure you knew.
But then just the response time seems very, very, very quick. After a couple of weeks, you'd think, that's not worth responding to.
Yeah. So 15 years ago, I was on SQL Server Central forums all the time and answering lots of questions. In the 90s, I was on whatever it was back then for Visual Basic. And constantly answering questions. And I don't know if, as I've gotten older, I can't multitask as well, but I just don't. And not only that, not only forums, but the same people are on Twitter and on Facebook and on all these things all day long. And I'm like, man, I've got work to do. So that is one area. That's one area where I do not contribute much. I'm very grateful for the people that do contribute, but I do not. I'm more likely to be writing, recording, or presenting. Those are the things I'm going to do. But as far as answering questions, man, the bad thing, I really liked doing the T-SQL questions at one time. And actually at Pragmatic Works, when I was there, they really encouraged us to answer questions when we were on the bench.
Oh, sure.
So the problem is, which I really wasn't on the bench that much, luckily, but the problem is, for me, someone puts a question out there, maybe they have the schema and the example, and then maybe they don't. So you have to ask them about it. And it's such a commitment to the question. Getting out the information from them, and maybe you've got a solution. Well, then you've got to, create a little database and populate it and try to work it. And populate it and try to work it out. And I just feel like it's too much of a commitment, you know? So I don't do it.
Yeah.
And obviously, Microsoft does look at that. That's one of the things they look at. But luckily, I do enough writing, recording, and presenting and volunteering that it doesn't hurt me that I don't answer questions.
Yeah, the metric they give on the MVP site is this guy from Brazil. He had 728 helpful posts.
That's awesome.
That must be total. So over the year, 185 answers and 406 posts. Like, holy cow.
Well, I guess they can do that. I do remember at one time, and I was at jobs, I was getting paid and I was able to do some of that, but I can't.
Yeah. That's true.
I can't. So I don't know. Maybe I just can't multitask anymore.
You know, I feel that if I'm going to go and answer questions on Stack Overflow or whatever out there, I've got to focus on that. And that's something that I can't really do when I'm doing work that I'm getting paid to do.
Right.
And there's got to be that separation there. So that bench time, as you mentioned it, if someone has a lot of bench time, well, they might have more opportunity there, but it's a balance in figuring that out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think part of putting together those presentations or even the courses, you mentioned your book, and having just put a book out myself, kind of that time and energy that it takes to do that. I guess the side benefit there is that you then become more familiar with that topic and can talk to it more rather than this specific, T-SQL problem that they're having where they're trying to loop or,
whatever it is,
whatever the specific implementation is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I just like what I do to scale. Occasionally people will send me a question personally. I will try to help them if I can, but
right. And that's different. If they're sending it to you.
I just had a gentleman who, I don't know if they were not that familiar with SSIS, but they had read a post on my blog site about SSIS and had a couple of questions, and I was able to help them, very easily with that question. And I felt good about that. But sometimes I feel like, and I haven't had anything like this for quite a while, but sometimes I feel like they're trying to get free consulting out of you, and it's just too much. So there are times whenever I'm asked personally and I say, this is bigger than we can do, email, this is bigger than we can do, email, maybe you want to put this question out on this other forum for people. If somebody sends me a question about replication or something, I've used it, but I'm not an expert on replication. It'd be better to go ask out on a replication forum, but.
Right. Yeah, there's a fine line right there, particularly as the MVP, you mentioned the time that you have to put in and then kind of chasing some of these specific problems when all the, the hundreds of myriads of variations that could take place can be difficult.
Just to clarify, that's just an estimate of what I do. I don't know what other people do, and there's no requirement. That's just pretty much what I do.
That's true.
On average.
Okay, now you've mentioned that you've been an MVP twice and that you originally had that and then you went to Microsoft and then you became an MVP again after that.
Right.
Now, how did you go about getting that? Is that something that somebody knows?
At Past Summit or a SQL Saturday, and people start asking you, hey, are you going to the MVP Summit this year? And then you'll say, well, no, because I'm not an MVP. And then they'll say, well, you should be. And then they'll nominate you. So that happens a lot. So I guess I can say who nominated me originally. This happened in, I guess, around 2007. People started saying this to me. And there were like 3 or 4 people that said, I'm going to nominate you. Well, one person did, and that was Andy Leonard, and I know you just had him on a podcast the other day because I listened to part of it. And so, he's such a sweetheart, but he nominated me. Of course, I didn't get it the first time. It took a couple times for it to go through, but that's usually it. You fill out this form. You can nominate yourself, but that sounds kind of weird. But somebody who thinks that you deserve it will nominate you. And then you may or may not get contacted. You deserve it, will nominate you. And then you may or may not get contacted from Microsoft. And if you do, then they're going to ask you to fill out a form listing all your activities for the past year. And then you may or may not hear anything back again. It's kind of weird because it just seems like if you're not having a conversation back and forth, don't expect to get the email on the MVP award day is what I would think,
Gotcha.
I would think you'd probably have some conversation back and forth with them. But even if you do, that's no guarantee that you're going to get it. So,
Yeah. So you mentioned the MVP award day, and I saw recently, right after the first of the year, I think there were a bunch of MVP renewals and new MVPs out there. Is that a annual thing or a quarterly thing, or how does that work?
it's quarterly. So it's January 1st, April 1st, July 1st, and October 1st. So the one is October 1st because it's not October, but April 1st because it's April Fool's Day. That's the really funny one.
We could all be MVPs for a day on April 1st.
We could be. Yeah. So it's a pretty exciting day for you. If you are up for renewal or if you've been nominated, you're going to be checking your email every 10 minutes. The frustrating thing is it comes out late morning or early afternoon, usually because they come out. So they're coming out of Redmond probably. So that's Pacific time. So, it is an exciting day if you get renewed. So far, so good. Here, I need to tell you something really cool about me in particular with MVP. Okay. So I first received MVP in 2008. And at that time, I asked the MVP lead, the guy, kind of liaison at Microsoft that dealt with it. I'm like, how of SQL Server MVPs? So he gave me these numbers. He didn't know. He knew at that time this is 2008. There were 4,000 MVPs in the world of any area total. Uh-huh. At the time, I think there were around 250 or 260 SQL Server MVPs at the time. And I don't know what it is now. And there were 60 SQL Server MVPs in the US, and 6 of those were women. So I was like, wow. Now the numbers are just fluctuating constantly, partly because Microsoft keeps hiring MVPs. They've hired a bunch of them recently.
That's true. Right. They have been on the hiring spree.
Right. But I think women have, you've got to get over your reluctance to promote yourself. I've had that. I feel like girls are taught from early on, work really hard and be really smart, but don't let from early on, work really hard and be really smart, but don't let people know about it. I feel like we've been taught that from childhood. And so I had to get over that and start learning how to really promote myself.
As the father of 4 girls, that's probably something I need to key in on because,
Yeah, you were really taught to be exceptional, but hide it. I saw that in my own daughter when she was a teenager. And especially if boys were around. All of a sudden, she was not quite as smart as,
Interesting.
Yeah, because she didn't want to be intimidating.
Right.
But I think that one of the WIT luncheons at Past Summit one year, they talked about becoming an MVP, and they started saying, hey, you need to let people know what you're doing. And then there were quite a few of us that became MVPs around then. I don't remember what year it was. So I think the number is still pretty small compared to the guys. But I think we're represented probably about the same percent that actually is working in the field. So I guess that's not bad.
So when you talk about letting people know what you're doing or promoting yourself, what type of things did you start to do differently at that point in time?
Yeah, I think it was a gradual process. But what I would do is, like, say, for example, I have a book coming out. I would contact Steve Jones and say, hey, I want to write an article that's going to promote my book. So I started thinking of ways to promote myself. I'm not much on Twitter, but if I have a new blog post or I have a new Pluralsight course or whatever, I'm going to get out there and promote that. I think part of it, speaking, trust me, I got a C in speech in college, and I was very ways to, I think, at least that I did, get myself out there. I look for opportunities that can help me in multiple ways, is really what I do.
So how many times in a year would you say that you generally speak at a SQL Saturday or other events?
Darn. I'm going to say at least 15. I'd have to go back out to my MVP thing and because I have everything tracked there. But I try to go to at least 6 SQL Saturdays a year. I've spoken at Past Summit every year for the last 4. I don't know how long my luck is going to hold out there, but somehow I've managed to do that. I speak a lot for the local user group. Plus, I do a lot of remote. So I'm going to say between 15 and 20 presentations a year.
Wow, that's really getting out there. I mean, that's more than one a month, and that's a big commitment.
Oh, yeah. But you know what? To me, once I started speaking, it became a little bit addictive. It's thrilling,
Yep.
Right.
I think I've had that same feeling on the addictiveness of speaking.
Mhm.
It's just the travel side of it that slows me down. Okay, so I guess at this point then, is there anything else that you want to share with us?
I think that there's a pretty high bar to make MVP, and I don't want people to be discouraged if they don't make it. Keep doing the things that you're doing. When I was at Microsoft, even though I wasn't eligible to be an MVP, I continued to do the same kinds of things I was doing because I loved it. Do these things because you love to do them. Don't do them because you want to be an MVP. I think an MVP has got to be, the MVP award's a side effect of doing these things you love. I don't love posting on forums, so I don't do it. But luckily, if for some reason I was not going to be an MVP anymore, that's always a possibility. Would I stop writing books? Maybe, but I'd still be writing blogs. I'd still be doing Pluralsight courses and speaking just because I love to do those things. So really,
Okay,
yeah,
that sounds great.
yeah,
Shall we move on to the SQL family questions then?
sure.
So can you share with us how you first got started using SQL Server?
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. I had just become a developer. I was a midlife career. Yeah, it was kind of crazy. I had just become a developer. I was a midlife career changer, and this was 1997. And I was working in a really teeny company. There were only 4 of us at this little startup, and they had bought a package of training courses for this other guy that worked there. And he was wanting to take, now they call them Systems Center, but one of those type classes, Operations Manager, one of those type classes. And the course just kept getting canceled. And the expiration date was coming up. And they said, Kathy, how would you like to take one of these courses at this training company? Because it doesn't look like this guy's going to use it. So I said, sure. And I saw there was a SQL Server class, and I went ahead and took that class. So that was early 98. So if it wasn't for the fact that that guy couldn't get his operations manager class in, I don't know how my life would have changed. I'm sure it would have actually getting to do anything or seeing it. And then shortly after that, then I started actually using it, implementing it at customers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, in all that time working with SQL Server, if there's one thing you could change about SQL Server, what would it be?
Well, right now, since Service Pack 1 came out and all of these cool features have been down, I don't know what you want to call it, now in standard, there's one feature I'd love to see backported down to standard edition, and that's read-only replicas in AG. So the availability, you can do availability groups in standard, and you could actually do that in 2016 before Service Pack 1, but they're only for failover. Right. I would just love to have a read-only replica at standard. That's what I would love to see.
Well, perhaps we'll see that in the next Service Pack or the next version. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm not going to hold my breath, though. I'm not going to hold my breath, though.
Okay. What is the best piece of career advice that you've received?
Yeah, so like I said, I was a midlife career changer. I had automated a auction at my kids' grade school. I was a pharmacist at the time, but I automated it with Microsoft Access. And this other parent saw what I was doing, and he worked for a company that produced training materials for technology. And he saw what I was doing, and he said, you could be a developer. And this was like early 90s, and somebody said something like that to me. You could be a developer. And he, got me some training materials, encouraged me to take a certification test. So I would say that was probably the best advice, just someone saying, hey, you could actually do this. That really got me started down this path.
And that's what actually
Working, like the first thing that happened was I was in my last year of pharmacy college, working my bachelor's in pharmacy back then. And there was a computer course where they had TRS-80s in the room. And the first time I saw a little program, we had to type the little programs in and record them on a tape recorder. The first time I actually typed a little program in that TRS-80, I was hooked from that moment on. It was like a light switch went off in my brain. I had programming and things like that as a hobby to just write some things for home up until I started doing some things for my kids' school. And then really that automating that auction was the project that got me started down the path. Before I felt like it was something that was out of reach.
Very interesting.
Our last question for you today, Kathi. If you could have one...
Before I felt like it was something that was out of reach.
Very interesting.
Our last question for you today, Kathi. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
So I'm going to change this up a little bit. I'm not really into superheroes that much, but I love Star Trek. So I love Star Trek, and I watched the entire Star Trek Next Generation while I was on the treadmill last year. And this year I'm double dipping. I'm watching Voyager and Deep Space Nine both at the same time this year. I always loved Star Trek, but I didn't get a chance to watch it a lot while my kids were little and so busy. So now I'm actually getting to do it. See an episode here and there. But my favorite technology on Star Trek is the replicator. If I could have a replicator, and it's going to look like a little microwave, I can just say to it, computer, tea hot, Earl Grey, Earl Grey hot, however Captain Picard says it, that can get you any food that you want or any piece of clothing that you want, just like that. I just think that would just be amazing. That's what I want.
There you go. I think Amazon would pay a lot of money to have that not be built.
You're right, but we have the 3D printers now that are not quite the same as replicator technology, but we're heading down that road, and people are printing all kinds of things. So someday we will be there. In fact, A-Press has got a book. I don't have the title in front of me, but A-Press has got a book about Star Trek technology. How they came up with the ideas, where the science is today, where it's going. So there's a chapter on each technology. So
it's really, really quite amazing how much technology has come out of things that were purely science fiction, like the communicator. And then now flip phones aren't even new technology anymore.
These little computers in our hands that we walk around with are better than the servers I was using in the late 90s. They're amazing. They're better than what they had on Star Trek. Everything you could ever want to know is right in there. And you can talk to it too if you want to.
Well, Kathi, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you.
It's been a pleasure for me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Kathi. This has been fun.
Yep. Thank you so much.
So thanks again, Kathi, for coming in and talking with us. Kind of an interesting discussion. I think one of the things that is unique, perplexing, and enlightening all at the same time is just the myriad of different ways in which people can contribute. And then, of course, having Microsoft trying to decide what makes the most sense for them to be connected and Microsoft MVP, award.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting on that is that one of the things that Kathi talked about is how she was previously an MVP, and then she went to work for Microsoft and lost that status. And then now she's not working at Microsoft and she's become an MVP again. So I've heard of several MVPs that has happened to over the years. So
yes. And so one thing, I guess it's a little bit, and I mentioned a sour point, if you will, and this is just my own experience. And so you're getting, the real Carlos here, if you will, in the sense that particularly as you get started with speaking, and PASS is a perfect opportunity to do that, you hear a lot of people, I don't know, maybe talking, whispering about kind of being on the MVP track or doing things to try to get MVP. And while I applaud everyone's efforts, I don't mean to diminish the program or say anything bad about that. I guess I will just advise, and that was me. That described me for a time. We should be careful about why we are participating in the community and what those reasons are, and then ultimately what our goals are, because there are many more benefits than just getting MVP award. So
yep. And I think that, one of the keys there that you hear from MVPs is that it's kind of an add-on once they've participated in the community for whatever their reason is, rather than they participate in the community in order to get that status. And I think that
exactly.
I enjoy participating in the community, and I do what I do because I'm interested in doing it, not because I'm trying to become an MVP or anything like that. It's what I do, and I love the work I do, and it's good stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And all the people that you meet, ultimately, we're co-hosting a podcast. We're co-hosting a podcast now, ultimately because the community was formed that allowed us to connect, being on opposite coasts, and to be able to, kind of foster a relationship and over something that we both enjoy.
Yep, I can remember at Past Summit 2015 in Seattle, Carlos, when I was headed into the, the Past Chapters Leader meeting. And you caught me, and that was the first time we met in person. And
that's right.
That was that sort of started our conversation going, and from there we ended up working together and jointly doing the podcast. So I think community is really the important piece there.
So next week, our guest is Javier Villegas from Argentina, and he was actually on episode 2. And he was actually my very first interview that I did in Argentina. So he's from Argentina. And his organization, a large shipping organization, recently migrated to 2016. We've talked a little bit about that up and give you some tips or some insights into some of the things that they were looking at to their problems. And then, of course, how he continues to use some of those features. So we hope that you'll find it.
And then the week after that, we'll be talking about T-SQL-T, the unit test framework for SQL Server.
Yes.
So a couple interesting weeks coming up. So once you're done listening to this podcast, stick around and see what we've got in the week after.
That's right. And if you have a topic that you think we should be talking about, let us know. You can leave a comment on the page at SQLDataPartners.com/podcast. There's even ability for you to record a question or your voice there. Or you can reach out to us on social media. I'm on Twitter at Carlos El Chacon.
And I'm on Twitter at SQLEMT.
Our music for SQL Server and the News is by Mansardian, used under Creative Commons. Thanks again for tuning in.
We'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.